Lord Snowdon didn't just cheat on Princess Margaret. He studied her, learned her weaknesses, and used them against her. That's not the same thing as being a bad husband. Bad husbands are careless. Bad husbands forget anniversaries, work too much, let passion fade into routine. What Antony Armstrong-Jones did to Princess Margaret over 18 years of marriage was something else entirely. He mapped her insecurities. He identified exactly where she was most fragile, and then he drove knives into those precise locations, over and over, with the patience of a man conducting an experiment. Infidelity is one crime. Psychological warfare is another. And when you look at the documented evidence, not gossip, not speculation, but accounts from people who witnessed it firsthand, what happened inside apartment 1A at Kensington Palace looks a lot more like the second than the first. But before you can understand what Snowdon did to Margaret, you have to understand who she was when he found her. You have to understand the wound she was already carrying. Princess Margaret Rose was born on August 21, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland. Second daughter, second in line. Second in everything that mattered. Her parents weren't king and queen yet. That transformation came 6 years later, in December 1936, when her uncle, Edward VIII, threw away the crown for Wallis Simpson, and Margaret's stammering father was thrust onto the throne as George VI. Margaret was 6 years old, and from that moment, the fundamental architecture of her life was fixed. Her sister Elizabeth would become queen. Margaret would become the spare. The sisters grew up during World War II largely at Windsor Castle, educated together by governesses, insulated from the bombing of London, but not from the anxiety of the era. Their governess, Marion Crawford, Croffy to the girls, later documented how differently the sisters were prepared for their futures. Elizabeth received instruction in constitutional history, languages, and the duties of a monarch. She was trained for sovereignty from childhood, meeting weekly with the Vice Provost of Eton to study the intricacies of British governance. Margaret received a less rigorous version of the same education. She was being prepared for a supporting role that offered neither the power of the crown nor the freedom of ordinary life. The message was implicit, but unmistakable. Elizabeth matters more. Elizabeth's education matters more. Elizabeth's future matters more. This does something to a person, especially a person as intelligent and perceptive as Margaret clearly was. Those who knew Margaret from childhood describe a girl who craved attention in a household where attention inevitably flowed toward the air. She was musical, genuinely talented at piano, with a voice that drew praise from professional musicians. She was theatrical, quick with language in a way that could make a room laugh or make a rival bleed, depending on her mood. She developed early what would become her signature weapon, a wit so sharp it could draw blood before anyone realized they'd been cut. When someone once asked her who in her life had caused her the most suffering, she reportedly answered, "Do you mean my sister, my mother, or my husband?" That's not a victim's response. That's a woman who could identify exactly where the damage came from and articulate it with surgical precision. Margaret was formidable, and that makes what happened to her more tragic, not less, because even her intelligence, even her famous sharp tongue, couldn't protect her from a man who had learned to weaponize her deepest vulnerabilities against her. The wound wasn't hidden. Anyone watching closely, anyone reading the press coverage, observing her at public events, listening to the chatter of London society, could have mapped precisely where her vulnerabilities lay. The need for validation, the fear of being overlooked, the gap between what she wanted and what her birth allowed her to have. Anyone paying attention could have identified her weaknesses. Someone eventually did. But first, there was Peter Townsend. Group Captain Peter Townsend entered Margaret's orbit in 1944, when he was appointed equerry to her father. He was a genuine war hero, a decorated RAF pilot who'd flown over 100 missions during the Battle of Britain and received the Distinguished Service Order and Distinguished Flying Cross for his valor. He was handsome in a refined, serious way, 16 years older than Margaret, and possessed of the kind of quiet integrity that the performative world of the palace rarely rewarded.
Margaret fell in love with him gradually, through proximity and admiration and the recognition of a kindred loneliness. Townsend's first marriage, to Rosemary Pauley, had ended when she left him for another man. He was raising 2 sons largely on his own while serving the royal family. He understood what it meant to be devoted to duty while carrying private sorrow. And he loved Margaret. Not the title, not the access, but the woman herself. Multiple accounts from those who knew them both confirm that his devotion was genuine and complete. The problem was the divorce. He hadn't left his wife. She'd left him. But in the eyes of the Church of England, of which Queen Elizabeth II was supreme governor, this distinction carried no weight. Divorce was divorce. The same principle had cost Margaret's uncle his throne. For Margaret to marry Townsend would require either the Queen's permission or renunciation of her rights of succession and all royal income. The affair became public in June 1953, when a journalist observed Margaret brushing a piece of fluff from Townsend's uniform at the Queen's coronation. A gesture too intimate to be innocent. The resulting scandal forced Townsend's exile to Brussels as an air attaché. Margaret, 22 years old, was told she couldn't marry without the Queen's permission until she turned 25. So she waited. She waited 2 years while the man she loved served in Belgium. She turned 25 on August 21st, 1955. And Parliament still refused to approve the marriage. The Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, himself a divorced man who had remarried, made clear that the government couldn't endorse the union. The hypocrisy was obscene. Eden's remarriage was acceptable. Margaret's marriage to a war hero whose wife had abandoned him was not. The standard was never about principle. The standard was about what the institution found convenient. On October 31st, 1955, Margaret released her public statement. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. These are the words of a woman being destroyed by an impossible choice and choosing duty as her family and country demanded. She gave up the man she loved because the institution required it, and the institution thanked her by handing her to a predator. Townsend quietly disappeared from her life. He traveled the world, eventually settling in France. In 1959, he married a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Germania, who bore a notable resemblance to Margaret herself. He died in 1995, having never spoken ill of her publicly. He protected her reputation, even when capitalizing on their history might have been lucrative. That was Peter Townsend. War hero, gentleman. The man Margaret was denied because of a divorce that wasn't his fault. Peter Townsend was a hero. Antony Armstrong-Jones was a chameleon. He came from a fractured household and grew up mastering the art of moving between worlds. His parents, Ronald Armstrong-Jones, a barrister, and Anne Messel, a society figure from an artistic Anglo-German Jewish family, divorced when he was young, and both remarried. Young Antony shuttled between homes, learning early how to charm, adapt, and perform different versions of himself depending on his audience. He contracted polio at 16, leaving one leg slightly shorter than the other, a vulnerability he transformed through sheer willpower into near invisibility, refusing to let anyone see him as limited. He was educated at Eton and Cambridge, remembered more for his social connections than his academic achievements. After university, he apprenticed to the society photographer Baron Sterling Henry Nahum, learning a trade that would give him access to every level of British society. By the mid-1950s, Armstrong-Jones had established himself in London's bohemian creative world, operating from a small studio in Pimlico, where he photographed debutantes, dancers, actors, and aristocrats. The thing about Armstrong-Jones is that he was genuinely talented. His photographs of the era demonstrate real artistic vision, dramatic lighting, unexpected angles, and ability to capture something essential about his subjects. He would later design the revolutionary aviary at the London Zoo and photograph the Queen herself for official portraits. His professional eye was sharp, perceptive, capable of seeing people clearly. He saw Margaret clearly, too. That was the problem. His reputation with women by this point was already well established among those who knew him. He was known for conducting simultaneous relationships, for a coldness that could appear without warning beneath the surface charm, for pursuing women with intense focus and then discarding them once the conquest was complete. He'd been romantically linked to the actress Jackie Chan, whom he reportedly continued seeing even as he pursued the princess. There were others, models, dancers, society women. The pattern wasn't secret. He collected women the way he collected photographic subjects. His interest in both tended to fade once the initial challenge had been met. This is the man who was introduced to Princess Margaret in 1958 at a dinner party hosted by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish. Margaret was 27 years old, still recovering from the Townsend heartbreak, still searching for something to fill the void. Armstrong-Jones was 28, handsome, witty, operating in a world completely unlike the stifling formality of palace life. He offered what she desperately craved: excitement, unconventionality, the feeling of being chosen rather than settled for. Their courtship was conducted in secret, away from the press and the palace. They met at his Pimlico studio, where the outside world couldn't observe them. He photographed her, creating intimacy through the camera's gaze. He seduced her with a combination of artistic sensitivity and sexual boldness that the proper world of royal suitors had never offered. He pursued her with focused intensity, and Margaret, starving for exactly this kind of attention, was drawn in completely. Throughout the courtship, Armstrong-Jones was still involved with other women. Multiple biographers have documented that his affair with Jackie Chan continued, even as he pursued the princess. Some sources suggest the overlap extended nearly to the wedding itself. The warning signs were visible to anyone who cared to look. Nobody looked. The engagement was announced on February 26, 1960, catching nearly everyone by surprise, including, reportedly, several of Armstrong-Jones's concurrent romantic interests. The wedding took place on May 6, 1960, at Westminster Abbey, in the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television. An estimated 300 million people watched as Princess Margaret married a man whose treatment of women should have disqualified him entirely. The Queen created him Earl of Snowdon shortly after the ceremony. And here's the darkest irony of all. Peter Townsend, war hero, decorated officer, man of demonstrated character, had been rejected because his wife abandoned him. Antony Armstrong-Jones, serial philanderer, emotional manipulator, man whose pattern with women was already documented, was embraced, titled, and celebrated. because he happened never to have married any of the women he'd used and discarded. The system that claimed to uphold moral standards had no mechanism for evaluating character at all. It measured only the technicalities of prior marriage. It was blind to everything that actually mattered about how a man treated the women in his life. Where exactly is the noble part? The couple moved into apartment 1A at Kensington Palace. David, Viscount Linley, was born on November 3, 1961. Lady Sarah Armstrong-Jones followed on May 1, 1964. For a brief period, they seemed to represent the modern, glamorous royal couple the palace had hoped for. But the fault lines were visible from the beginning. Lord Snowdon had built his identity around his work as a photographer, and marriage to a princess threatened to reduce him to a consort role he found intolerable. He was a man who needed to be the most interesting person in any room. He'd married a woman whose royal status guaranteed she would always command more attention than he did. The dynamic that had drawn him to her during the courtship, the thrill of pursuing a princess, reversed once she was caught. Now her status wasn't an attraction, it was a humiliation. A constant reminder that he was, in the cruel calculus of aristocratic hierarchy, the lesser partner. His response was to reassert dominance through the only mechanisms available to him. He converted a basement space at Kensington Palace into a photography studio and began spending long hours there, locked away from Margaret and the children. When Margaret, who had nothing to fill her days but the empty rituals of royal life, attempted to join him in the workroom, she was sent upstairs again. The exclusion was deliberate and humiliating. He could retreat to his work. She had nowhere to go. The locked door of that basement studio became a symbol of their entire marriage. He on one side, pursuing his art and his affairs and his life outside of her, while she waited upstairs in a palace that had become a prison. Yes, Margaret had her own affairs. Roddy Llewellyn is the famous one. I'm not going to pretend she was a saint. But there's a difference between a woman seeking escape from systematic cruelty and a man conducting affairs as sport. There's a difference between desperation and predation, and if you can't see that difference, I don't know what to tell you. But let's talk about what Snowdon actually did. Not the affairs. Those are almost beside the point. Let's talk about the notes. According to Lady Anne Glenconner, Margaret's lady-in-waiting and one of her closest confidants, Snowdon developed a habit of writing cruel messages and hiding them throughout their Kensington Palace apartment for Margaret to discover alone. Glenconner documented this in her 2019 memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, drawing on decades of direct observation and Margaret's own confessions. The notes appeared in glove boxes, between pages of books Margaret was reading, tucked into bedside tables, hidden among her clothing. One documented note read, "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you." Think about that note for a moment. Really think about it. It attacks her appearance, targeting the insecurity of a woman who was always compared unfavorably to her sister's more conventional beauty. It invokes class anxiety, comparing a princess to a working-class tradesperson, as if to remind her that despite her title, she's nothing special. And it employs an anti-Semitic stereotype with a particularly cruel twist. Snowdon himself had Jewish heritage through his mother's Messel family. That's not random cruelty. That's a man who understood the weapon he was using. Either he was projecting his own complicated relationship with his heritage onto his wife as an insult, or he was deliberately invoking a prejudice he knew would sting precisely because of its ugliness. Either way, it reveals someone who thought carefully about how to inflict maximum damage. Another note was reportedly a list titled 20 Reasons Why I Hate You. Some sources say 24, cataloging his contempt in written form. Margaret eventually told Glenconner that she'd stopped opening her own chest of drawers entirely. She delegated the task to her maid, because she'd grown so afraid of what she might find hidden inside. A princess. afraid to open her own dresser, in her own home. This isn't impulsive cruelty, the flare of anger during an argument that someone later regrets. This is premeditated. It requires sitting down, taking pen to paper, composing a message designed to wound, and then hiding it in a location where the victim will discover it alone, without witnesses, without any opportunity for confrontation or explanation. This is a man who studied his target, who understood that Margaret's deepest wounds related to not feeling beautiful enough, not feeling valued enough, not being the one who matters. Whether this study was conscious and deliberate or intuitive and instinctive, the effect was the same. The cruelty was precisely calibrated to inflict maximum damage on a woman whose vulnerabilities were not well hidden. By the early 1970s, the marriage had deteriorated to what Philip Hoare, writing Snowdon's obituary in 2017, described as the level of exchanged grunts when passing in the hallway. They occupied the same residence, but lived essentially separate lives. Snowdon remained locked in his basement studio for hours. Margaret waited upstairs, drinking more heavily as the years passed, watching her husband demonstrate through daily behavior that her presence was unwanted. "I have as much privacy as a goldfish in a bowl," she observed. The image is devastating. Visible, contained, unable to escape. Watched constantly by the public, ignored by the man who was supposed to love her, understood by almost no one. And then came Mystique, and Roddy Llewellyn, and the photographs that ended everything. Margaret had found escape on the Caribbean island of Mystique, where her friend Colin Tennant had given her a plot of land as a wedding present. She built a house there called Les Jolies Eaux, the beautiful waters, and it became her refuge from the marriage that was suffocating her. On Mystique, away from the press and the palace, she could breathe. In 1973, she met Roddy Llewellyn at a house party in Scotland. He was 25 years old. She was 43. He was a landscape gardener from a good family, gentle and sweet-natured, entirely unlike the cold sophisticate she had married. Their relationship developed over the following years, friendship first, then something more. In February 1976, the News of the World published photographs of Margaret and Roddy together on Mystique. She was in a bathing suit. He was shirtless. They were sitting together at a table, looking comfortable in each other's company. The photographs were the excuse the institution needed. On the same day that Prime Minister Harold Wilson announced his resignation, Buckingham Palace released the news of Princess Margaret's legal separation from Lord Snowdon, the first royal separation since Henry VIII. The timing was deliberate. The palace buried her humiliation in a bigger news cycle. Even in the moment of her marriage's public collapse, Margaret wasn't important enough for her own headline. The divorce was finalized in May 1978. They were the first royal couple to divorce in more than 400 years. Here's what I want you to understand. The story you probably heard about Margaret and Snowdon is a story about two difficult people whose marriage fell apart. About infidelity on both sides, about incompatibility and ego and the pressures of royal life. That's not the story. The story is about a woman who was denied the good man who loved her because of a technicality that had nothing to do with his character. The story is about a system that claimed to protect moral standards while having no mechanism to evaluate actual morality. The story is about that woman being handed instead to a man who had already demonstrated repeatedly that he viewed women as conquests to be acquired and discarded. And the story is about what that man did once he had her. He didn't just cheat. He studied her. He learned where she was vulnerable, her need for validation, her fear of being overlooked, her desperate hunger to be the one who matters for once in her life. And he used that knowledge, systematically, over years, with notes hidden in drawers and locked doors, and the slow, grinding cruelty of making someone feel worthless in their own home.
Snowdon wasn't a weak man who couldn't help himself. He was a predator who chose his victim, identified her vulnerabilities, and destroyed her with precision. The tragedy isn't that Margaret's marriage failed. The tragedy is that she was never allowed to choose a man who might have loved her. Peter Townsend died in 1995, having lived the rest of his life with quiet dignity in France with his wife Marie Luce. Snowdon died in 2017, having been married twice more. His second wife, Lucy Lindsay Hogg, he wed in 1978, just months after the divorce from Margaret. They divorced in 2000. He had fathered children with multiple women, some during his marriages, having conducted himself until the end exactly as he always had. The pattern never changed. Margaret wasn't unlucky. She was one in a long series of women who discovered what he was only after it was too late. Margaret died on February 9, 2002, at 71 years old, after years of declining health. Her last decade was marked by strokes, by a scalding accident in 1999 when she severely burned her feet in the bath, by the accumulated damage of a life lived under pressure and pain. She died 50 years after her father, King George VI, the father whose death had made her sister queen and fixed Margaret forever in the role of the spare. She deserved better than what the institution gave her. She deserved Peter Townsend. She got Lord Snowdon instead. And now you know what that actually meant. Subscribe for more stories like this.